So there was a case of a man named Dred Scott, okay? And essentially he moved into a free territory with his master and eventually sued for his right to be free because he had entered into a free territory, right? The Dred Scott case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And Chief Justice Cheney wrote some of the most haunting words that I think affects the public discourse on black life in a way that I think is eerily familiar to you. In his decision, he wrote these words: that no black man has no rights that any white man has to respect at any time. And the case was Dred Scott versus Sanford. Alright. With that being said, that sort of frames the reality of what we're calling Afro-pessimism. Okay? It is the belief that the notion of black sovereignty, legitimacy, freedom, justice, equality, never gonna happen. That makes sense so far? So the theory behind Afro-pessimism speaks to that reality, that no matter what happens, okay, there will be some things that look like progress, but at the end of the day, that reality of black freedom is just never going to be a complete thing. All right? Now, so we're gonna give you a couple of things, kind of to give you just some theory on it. All right. First thing I'll be quoting is David Walker's Appeal, 1829. David Walker, famous black abolitionist, 1829. Now, mind you, this is a black person writing in 1829. So what does that mean? Well, it means a couple things. Number one, if you were black living in any place where slavery was legal, literacy was not a thing. You could be literally killed, maimed, tortured, whatever, for being literate. Okay? So when David Walker writes this appeal in 1829, it's extremely radical. One, because he's a black man. Two, because he's a black man that's writing. And three, because he writes it to Africans, enslaved Africans. So it sends the message that he's not the only literate one. All right? And so I'll be quoting that at length. It will be recollected that in my first edition of my appeal, I promise to demonstrate in the course of my appeal, to the satisfaction of the most incredulous mind, that we colored people of the United States are the most wretched, degraded, and abject set of beings that ever lived since the world began, down to the present day, and that the white Christians in America, who hold us in slavery, or more properly speaking, pretenders of Christianity, treat us more cruel and barbarous than any heathen nation did any people who had subjected or reduced to the same condition. That the Americans, who are notwithstanding looking for millennial day, have us, all I ask is for a candid and careful perusal of this third and last edition of my appeal, where the world may see that we, the blacks or colored people, are treated more cruel by white Christians of America than devils themselves ever treated a set of men, women, and children on this earth. It is expected, Walker continues, it is expected that all colored men and women and children who are not deceitful, abject, and servile to resist the cruelties and murders inflicted upon us by our white slave owners, our enemies by nature, of every nation, language, and tongue under heaven, will try to procure a copy of this appeal and read it, or get someone to read it to them, for it is designed more particularly for them. Let them remember that though our cruel oppressors and murderers treat us more cruel, as Pharaoh did the children of Israel. Yet the God of the Ethiopians has been pleased to hear our moans in consequence of oppression, and the day of our redemption from abject wretchedness draweth near, when we shall be enabled, in the most extended sense of the word, to stretch forth our hands to the Lord our God. But must be willingness on our part for God to do these things for us. We may be assured that he will not take us by the hairs of our head against our will and desire, and drag us from every mean, low, and abject condition. Okay? So Walker is espousing that the condition of the black subject in America during the period of enslavement is the most degraded, abject subject position he's seen. Why? I'll explain that in a few minutes. But the core idea is they have absolutely no control over any part of their subjectivity. Their physical bodies, their physical labor, their sexuality, the ability to claim family ties and blood ties, relationships that they choose with each other is not respected, etc., 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 etc. All right, we got it? Does that make sense to everybody? So, the next quote I have is from a woman by the name of Harriet Jacobs. And the title of this place where this is written is called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. All right? And what she does here is she talks about a family member of hers named Benjamin. Okay? And the title of the chapter in her text, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, is called The Slave Who Dared to Feel Like a Man. The Slave Who Dared to Feel Like a Man. Okay, and what Jacobs is going to explain to all of us in her text, she tries to let you into the condition of being an enslaved African in America. All right? So let's start with her description of Benjamin. But alas, even the charms of the old oven failed to reconcile us to our hard lot. Benjamin was now a tall, handsome lad, strong and gracefully made, and with a spirit too bold and too daring to be a slave. Okay? I'll repeat that. It said Benjamin was now a tall, handsome lad, strongly and gracefully made, and with a spirit too bold to be a slave. Okay? So she's trying to get you into the psyche of Benjamin, and also a description of this person. We don't have an exact height or weight or anything like that for how tall he was, but you understand that this is a very live human being. Right? He's somebody who has a strong personality, probably thinks for himself, all those sorts of things. All right? It's kind of hard because some of this stuff is sort of graphic. All right. So now Benjamin's, given a description of Benjamin. Now we're going to move down to page 35. Now Benjamin has fled the plantation. When my grandmother returned home and found her youngest child had fled, great was her sorrow. But with characteristic piety, she said, God's will be done. Each morning she inquired if any news had been heard from her boy. Yes, news was heard. The master was rejoicing over a letter announcing the capture of his human chattel. That day seems but as yesterday. So well do I remember it, I saw him led through the streets in chains to jail. His face was ghastly pale, yet full of determination. He had begged one of his sailors to go to his mother's house and ask her not to meet him. He said the sight of her distress would take from him all self-control. She yearned to see him, and she went. But she screened herself in the crowd, that it might be as her child had said. We were not allowed to visit him, but we had known the jailer for years, and he was a kind-hearted man. At midnight, he opened the jail door for my grandmother and myself to enter in disguise. When we entered the cell, not a sound broke the stillness. Benjamin, Benjamin, whispered my grandmother. No answer, Benjamin, she again faltered. There was a jingle of chains. The moon had just risen and cast an uncertain light through the bars of the window. We knelt down and took Benjamin's cold hand in ours. We did not speak. Sobs were heard, and Benjamin's lips were unsealed. For his mother was weeping on his neck. How vividly does memory bring back that sad night. Mother and son talked together. He had asked her pardon for the suffering he had caused her. She had nothing to forgive. She could not blame his desire for freedom. He told her that when he was captured, he broke away and was about casting himself into the river when thoughts of her came over. And he desisted. She asked if he did not also think of God. I saw his face grow fierce in the moonlight. He answered, no, I don't think of him. When a man is hunted like a wild beast, he forgets there is a God. A heaven. He forgets everything in his struggle to get beyond the reach of the bloodhound. Don't talk so, Benjamin, said she. Put your trust in God, be humble, my child, and your master will forgive you. Forgive me for what, mother? For not letting him treat me like a dog? No, I will never humble myself to him. I've worked for him for nothing all my life, and I am repaid with stripes and imprisonment. Here I will stay till I die, or till he sells me. The poor mother shuddered at his words. I think he felt it, for when he next spoke, his voice was calmer. Don't fret about me, mother. I ain't worth it, said he. I wish I had some of your goodness. You bear everything patiently, just as thou thought it. It was all right. I wish I could. She told him that she had not always been so. Once she was like him, but when her sore troubles came upon her, and she had no arm to lean upon, she learned to call on God, and he lightened her burdens. She besought him to do likewise. We overstayed our time and were obliged to hurry from the jail. Benjamin had been in prison for 3 weeks when my grandmother went to intercede for him with his master. He was immovable. He said Benjamin should serve as an example to the rest of the slaves. He should be kept in jail till he was subdued, or be sold if he got but $1 for him. However, he afterwards relented in some degree. The chains were taken off, and we were allowed to visit him, which means that he had been in chains that whole time. As his food was of the coarsest kind, we carried him as often as possible a warm supper, accompanied with some little luxury for the jailer. 3 months elapsed, and there was no prospect of release or of a purchaser. One day he was heard to sing and laugh. His piece of indifference was told to his master, and the overseer was ordered to rechain him. He was now confined in an apartment with other prisoners, who were covered with filthy rags. Benjamin was chained near them and was soon covered with vermin. He worked at his chains till he succeeded in getting out of it. He passed them through the bars of the window with a request that they should be taken to his master. They should be informed that he was covered with vermin. This audacity was punished with heavier chains and prohibition of visits. So just the idea that you want to be free, this is the punishment. Covered in vermin, not allowed to be clean, not allowed to do any of those things, which you wouldn't also be able to access if you just were an enslaved person in the first place. and your family is powerless to help you. And you notice the name of the chapter is the punishment for thinking you're a man, for just wanting to think that you can access humanity and you have any rights at all, right? Harriet Jacobs is saying these are just some of the things that she witnessed. Not to mention her own levels of abuse, her own levels of lack of power, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So, the conditions of enslavement, that reality, all right? And we heard David Walker say that we are the most abject, degraded, and wretched, degraded, and abject set of beings that have ever lived in the world. Okay? So that's the condition of being enslaved. Subject to random violence, random losses of subjectivity. You can't claim family. You can't claim blood ties. You are subject to violence of any kind, every kind, right? And that's the reason. That's the reality they live in. Okay? So if we look at, so let's think of it this way. First slave came to America in 1869. The Emancipation Proclamation was in 1863. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution ratified in 1865. Reconstruction of the South after the Civil War goes until 1877. Okay? Rutherford B. Hayes then becomes president. Troops get pulled out of the South, and Jim Crow starts. All right? So from 1877, the beginning of Jim Crow, all the way through the 1960s, segregation. And in the middle, you get the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, the rise of the Aryan Brotherhood. Okay. The rise of the Ku Klux Klan, the rise of the Aryan Brotherhood, all sorts of things. The black codes, right? The penal system. Sharecropping, which is slavery by another name. The lynching epidemic shows up. And while all of this is happening, people are arguing that this is better than enslavement. So these instances of the Ku Klux Klan and lynchings and public lynchings and all of these things are seen as improvements from the reality of being enslaved. And so when I'm talking about lynching people, I'm not just talking about just the literal being hung from trees until you die. That's one thing. But these things would be well attended. I'm talking thousands of people would show up. These things would be talked about in the local newspaper, which is the dominant media of the time. Okay? They would say, they'd give you like a statement. They would just say like, we're coming on this day, we're gonna hang us a nigga. There were places that are still exist in the United States called sundown towns. Write that down. Sundown town. That meant that if you lived in a certain place, you had to be, a black person had to be in their home and off the street before the sun went down. All right? Now, in 1882, the Chicago Tribune began publishing, this is according to the New York Times. In 1862, when the Chicago Tribune began publishing each January a list of all of the executions and lynchings in the previous year, the Tuskegee Institute began releasing a list in 1912, and in 1919, the NAACP published what its researchers said was a comprehensive list of lynchings in the previous 3 decades. In 1975, the sociologist Stuart Tolney and E.M. Beck researched the existing list, eliminating errors and duplicates, and compile what many consider the most accurate inventory to that time. The report released Tuesday says that the new inventory has 700 names that are not on any of the previous lists, which Mr. Stevenson said were discovered during the compilation of the report. Professor Beck, who teaches at the University of Georgia, has now reviewed the new list, but he pointed out that with racial violence so extensive and carried out in so many different ways, compilers of the list may differ on what constitutes a lynching. A new list, as opposed to some previous ones, include one-time massacres of large numbers of African Americans, such as occurred in Arkansas in 1919 and in Louisiana in 1887. Quote, if you're trying to make a point that the amount of racial violence is underestimated, well, then there's no doubt about it, Professor Beck says. What people don't realize here is just how many there were and how close, places they drive by every day. Among Professor Beck's findings were that the number of lynchings did not rise or fall in proportion to the number of state-sanctioned executions, underscoring what Mr. Stevenson said was a crucial point, that these brutal deaths were not about administering popular justice, but terrorizing a community. All right? So, all of this is happening in a post-chattel slavery context. Welcome to emancipation, people. So you go from literal enslavement with some of the treatment that Harry Jacobs described and the reality that David Walker sort of describes. And you walk out of the frying pan into the fire. Here's what happens next. This is the condition of being black in America. Okay? And as I told you in the camp-wide lecture, all of these sorts of things lead W.B. Du Bois to say in 1903, in the middle or in the beginning of some of the things that are described in this New York Times article, that the problem of the 20th century would be the problem of the color line. To paraphrase, the white races of the world against the dark races of the world. It's in the book, The Souls of Black Folk, page 7. Not saying I memorized the page, I'm just saying that's what page is on. All right. So we got that? So, as I said, first slaves came to America in 1619, Emancipation Proclamation 1863. 13th Amendment to the Constitution ratified 1865. Reconstruction goes to 1877. Rutherford B. Hayes becomes the president. Troops get pulled out of the South. Jim Crow starts, goes all the way through the 20th century. In the 1960s, we have the 1964 Civil Rights Act, a landmark piece of legislation in the United States to outlaw discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. 1968 Fair Housing Act prohibited discrimination concerning the sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, religion, national orientation, and sex. Also 1965 Voting Rights Act, which has also been gutted, by the way. And so we now see a lot of the voter restrictions that were in that pre-1965 Voting Rights Act showing up again. Okay? So now we're into the 20th century, in the 21st century, okay? And so we're going to first talk about, in order to understand Afro-pessimism, we had to get that slavery history out of the way, the Jim Crow history out of the way. And now we need to talk about sort of the theoretical basis for where that comes from. So we talked about critical race theory the other day. Y'all remember that? Okay. One of the eminent scholars of critical race theory was a former legal professor who worked at NYU and Harvard named Dr. Derrick Bell. D-E-R-R-I-C-K-B-E-L-L. What's funny? What you laughing for? Now, he wrote an article entitled, two articles we're going to talk about. One is called The Racism is Permanent Thesis, Courageous Revelation or Unconscious Denial of Racial Genocide.
Wait, again?
The Racism is Permanent Thesis, Courageous Revelation or Unconscious Denial of Racial Genocide. All right? So we're going to quote first the racism is permanent thesis. Okay, here we go. Quote. The racism is permanent, the permanence of racism. In this article, I want to offer a summary of my arguments for the proposition that American racism is not, as Gunnar Myrdal concluded in his massive study, An American Dilemma, an anomaly on our democratic landscape, a holdover from slavery that the nation both wants to cure and is capable of curing. Rather, it is a critically important stabilizing force that enables whites to bind across a wide socioeconomic chasm. Without the deflecting power of racism, masses of whites would likely wake up and revolt against the severe disadvantage they suffer in income and opportunity when compared with those whites at the top of our socioeconomic heap. Making the racism is permanent case has proven relatively easy for most blacks who have heard it. Most, though far from all, whites are more resistant, running the gamut from those who are deeply troubled but unable to refute the basis of my thesis to those who are angrily reject the idea, charging that I am racist for even suggesting it. This debate has been vigorous and I hope has moved the focus from either the 4 decades-long struggle to eliminate racism by outlawing it or the victim-blaming rationale for its continuance. Black people need to prove themselves worthy. Okay? So he's saying that given the history, most of which I've outlined in the last few moments, from the reality of enslavement, beaten, brutalized, sold, assaulted in any number of ways, right? Physically, sexually, and otherwise, both men, women, and children, okay? The Jim Crow era of segregation, lynching, church bombings, mass murders, all of these things, to now what you're seeing, which is the rise of the prison industrial complex, vicious police brutality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of those things. He's saying, even though people can't necessarily refute that permanence from 1619 until now, right? People angrily disagree. But his argument is, you can be mad. Do you have an argument? Given the history, is there an argument? Right? So the root of Afro-pessimism comes from sort of these same ideas, some of the ideas that Derek Bell gets into, which is racism being permanent. And Bell argues that it's a stabilizing force. What do we mean by stabilizing? Yes.
Like, it kind of provides a structure for, like, the American society. Because, is that referring to, like, thinking about, like, white people needing, like, something to, like, they need a group that's, like, that they can see as, like, below them so they don't have, like, they don't get upset about the inequality between them?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's perfect. Okay. Is that white people could very much be upset about wealth inequality, all these other things, but instead they have what Du Bois called a psychological way to whiteness. That because I'm white, I'm now better than black people, better than the entire other group, and therefore, even though I don't have things good all the time, I'm not them. Which stops complete upheaval from happening in the country, right? Because there's a reality of somewhat being superior. Because without that, they might challenge these other things and it'd be impossible to keep the country going the way it is.
So is it almost like white people have this like out of sight, out of mind like theory going about it? Or like...
It's kind of like this. It would be like, so if you notice a lot of the pictures of, all of you go look at the pictures of many of the lynchings of African Americans, you'll notice that it's usually poor people doing it, right? You see a bunch of overall wearing, horrible people doing it, right? It's not exclusively so, but a lot of people, right? And Bell's argument here, and Du Bois' earlier argument was, it would make sense, given their low socioeconomic status, that they would probably want to align themselves with black people who are also poor, landless, etc. However, because of the reality of anti-black racism, they say, I might not have anything, but I'm not black. So that's now so now you have a class of people that are designated by race, which are black people. Right? If you notice, a lot of the states that vote for horrible, blatantly corporatist Republicans, right, happen to all be some of the poorest places in the country. Mississippi, Alabama. It would make sense for them to want a more liberal agenda, but they're like, it's still a little better than this group over here. So the more problematic the rhetoric gets on race, that's how it happens. There was a political strategy called the Southern strategy. You can look at it. Where Republicans would go into the South and basically become more racist than they probably naturally are. Because they knew that would get a lot of votes. All right. Now, all right. So Derek Bell wrote an earlier article. That article, The Racism is Permanent Thesis. He wrote an earlier article in 1980 called Brown versus Board of Education and the Interest Convergence Dilemma. All right. This is a precursor to the idea of a structural adjustment. Okay. So Derek Bell in this 1980 article, which can be found on JSTOR, says, it is quoting, he talks about a professor named Charles Black, okay? And he says, Professor Charles Black therefore correctly viewed racial equality as the neutral principle which underlay the Brown opinion. In Black's view, Welch's question is awkwardly simple, and he states his response in the form of syllogism. He says, Black's major premise is that, quote, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment should be read as saying that the Negro race, as such, is not to be significantly disadvantaged by the laws of the states. His major premise is that segregation is a massive, intentional disadvantaging of the Negro race, as such, by state law. The conclusion, then, is that the Equal Protection Clause clearly bars racial segregation because segregation harms blacks and benefits whites in ways too numerous and obvious to require citation. Logically, the argument is persuasive, and Black has no trouble urging that when the directive of equality cannot be followed without displeasing the whites, then something that can be called a freedom of whites must be impaired. Bell says, it is precisely here that many whites part company with Professor Black. Whites may agree in the abstract that blacks are citizens and are entitled to constitutional protection and against racial discrimination, but few are willing to recognize that racial segregation is more than a series of quaint customs that can be remediated effectively without altering the status of whites. The extent of this unwillingness is illustrated by the controversy over affirmative action programs, particularly those where identifiable whites must step aside for blacks they deem less qualified or less deserving. Whites simply cannot envision the personal responsibility and the potential sacrifice inherent in Professor Black's conclusion that true equality for blacks will require the surrender of racism-granted privileges for whites. He calls that interest convergence. That white people might see something wrong with the way in which the structure disadvantages is black, but are not willing to make any personal sacrifices of their own to challenge that. Everybody got that so far? All right. Now, what makes this interesting, okay? What makes this interesting for many of you is Wilson kind of calls on a lot of these ideas as well, all right? He calls that a structural adjustment. And we'll do something to make it a little more comfortable for anti-black racism to exist, but we're not going to be able to fix it completely. The system won't fix it completely. Okay? All right, so we got that? We got all of that? All right. Slave ontology, gratuitous violence. Okay? Alright. Slave ontology, gratuitous violence. So we're going to talk about this, these two sort of concepts, and then we're going to hopefully we'll jump in. Alright. So the concept, one of the two greatest concepts in Afro-pessimist theory, particularly in the way it gets explained in our activity, is slave ontology, gratuitous violence. This is the argument that says that since 1619 and the existential removal of black people as human subjects via slavery, what is perpetuated is this notion of a slave ontology. All right, that as far as the system is concerned, black people have not transcended slavery. That you may, like the notion of actual chattel slavery may have ended, but the way in which that is marked on your melanin still exists. To be black is to exist as a slave, not free, subject to random violence, as Taney said, with no rights, and no white man has to ever recognize at any point, anytime. You need to go outside for a minute? I won't be there. Just don't go. All right. So that's the reality. We got that so far? Okay. He says that how we can recognize this marker of slave ontology by the reality of gratuitous violence. Now, gratuitous violence, okay, there's one more thing. Okay, gratuitous violence means that you are subject to violence all the time, every second of every day. That is the condition of being black. You could be on your way to the store buying Skittles and iced tea, violence. You could be seatbelted in your car, violence. You could be walking down the street, violence. You could be selling loose cigarettes. You could be choked to death with an illegal chokehold. Doesn't matter. Cool. We can have you on videotape getting beat by the police unmercifully. Cool. Right? Subjects of gratuitous violence happening all the time. Right? Now, the comparison between this sort of violence is to say that there are violences that happen as a result of particular events. Okay? What? All right. Particular events. So, that's not to say that the system will just hate black people. It'll say that the other kinds of violence will be what you call contingent violences. All right? All right? Contingent violence means, right? Contingent violence means that the system will hate you based on something that they can apply to you based on an event that happens. Islamic populations in the United States post 9/11. Contingent violence. When we start burning Qurans and we start demonizing Muslims. Using terms like radical Islam to describe every Muslim. Even though it's the biggest religion in the world, organized religion in the world. Okay? The reality of internment camps in World War II. Famously, the Korematsu decision was about that. Japanese immigrants. All right? So, means contingent violence happens as a result of events, 9/11, World War II, etc., 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 right? Gratuitous violence, though, is the juxtaposition. This is sort of juxtaposition in Afro-pessimist theory. That gratuitous violence means all day, every day. And that is what most of these scholars who do Afro-pessimism say is the condition of being black. Subject to random violence all the time. There's not a moment that you spend in your life not safe, where you are safe from that sort of violence. Okay? Which is different from the contingent violence. All right? That is what these are the sort of core ideas. Okay? You have to understand these three things. All right? And all of this comes together to create this idea of what we call social death. All right? The condition of having a slave ontology, gratuitous violence, loss of blood ties. What I mean by loss of blood ties and family ties is, for most black people, they got a name like Johnson, Lewis, Stanton, Randall. Right? And those people are the names of the last person, Alston, Timmons. They're the name of the last family that owned black people. So we don't have access to subjectivity in the same way as many other people. We say African American, but we don't really know what that means. We can't say Ghana, we can't say Nigeria, we can't say Kenya, right? We don't know what ethnic group. We can't say Yoruba, Twi, Kuyu, Yoruba, Fulani, Ga.
Mende.
Yes, Mende. We can't really do any of that. And all of that culminates into what the condition of social death is. You are not. There's nothing congruent about how you can access history, culture, family, etc. Right? All right. That's the basis of the idea. Now, so the position that I wrote for you all, that you all helped me write rather, all right, calls for teleological suspension of whiteness. Okay? Now, what this means is that the notion of racism, because as you so eloquently said, it is a stabilizing feature. Right? It's a stabilizing feature of the society. That the society depends on it. It keeps a lot of people calm and in their place and not questioning the system and threatening to destroy it because we have a group who they feel like they're better than. All right? So this means that because of its stabilizing nature, you can't just rationally call it out of existence through rational argument. Right? Bell talks about the permanence of racism and entrance conversion. Is that in order to stop it from happening, stop this anti-blackness from happening, you have to, in terms of its material value at least, right? You have to actually have white people sacrifice the things that they've gotten from racial privilege.
I think my phone ran out of data.
Sure.
Not data, space, yeah.
It's cool.
It's been recording for like 40 minutes now.
All right, cool. Cool, gotcha. All right, so you got that in place? Does everybody understand that so far? Okay. So the call for teleological suspension of whiteness is to say that you have to say that it has to cease. And you cannot use rational argument to do so because of the stabilizing nature that it has. It has to be called out of existence. It cannot be written out of existence. You all can stop me at any point if you have a question. Yes?
What's the difference between being called out of existence versus being written?
So if you say you should not mistreat black people, right? Then I go, Lauren, that might cost you your job because they were actively discriminating against black people at your law firm, and that's a problem.
You'd be willing to do the job.
Would you be right? Are you willing to give that job up because they have discriminatory hiring practices that meant that they didn't hire any black attorneys at your law firm? Right. And Bell's argument is, white people, that's right where the line, that's the wall. Whoa. Can't you just give Johnny a job? Do you have to did Johnny have to get my job because of the fact that we didn't hire Johnny because he was black? Right? And that's sort of the beef about affirmative action, minority set-asides, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's the wall of whiteness, I like to call it. Most white people are very liberal about certain things like that until you say, but we're gonna need to move into your neighborhood. We're gonna need access to your bank account. We're gonna need your job. And you go, wait a minute. You need my job? Yes, your job. We need that. We're gonna need that. Thank you. Right? Those are the things. So teleologically suspend whiteness says we gotta call it out of existence. It's an active call to say this thing cannot exist, but it's not using rational argument necessarily to do so. Yes? Question, comment? Okay? That's the reality. You have a question, Sharad? Yep. Okay. That's the alternative, the teleologically suspend whiteness. Call it out of existence because can't work through rational argument. Because we know that slavery was bad, I hope. We know that Jim Crow was bad. We know that lynching was terrible. We know all these things. The question is, what do we do now? And Headley's argument is, got to be a teleological suspension because otherwise, it doesn't really work. Because racism has practical value in the society. You good? Make sense? Right. Yes.
I don't understand how teleologically.
Speak up a little louder.
I don't understand how teleologically suspending whiteness can even attempt to solve the social gap.
Well, see, the thing is that I don't know if, one, I mean, we don't really make that claim. But two, I think that the reality is social death is the reality of being black in a white society. Okay? It is experiencing those other things that I talked about, the gratuitous violence, the slave ontology, right? And these things are because whiteness has made a comparison between itself and blackness. Okay? So without blackness, whiteness doesn't lose what Whittleson calls coherence, right? Throws the world into coherence because without blackness, there's nothing to justify whiteness even existing. Yeah, you feel that? That makes sense. So if you suspend whiteness, you say that thing shouldn't exist anymore. It's hard for blackness to be, as Walker said, as abject and degraded as it. And that, Julia, that piece, that Alice Walker piece that we were talking about, that you could do, this is like, that's the reality of the argument. Is that this notion of whiteness, because, okay, let's back it up a little bit and then, okay. So, write this author's name down. Frances Cress Welsing. Frances Cresswelsing. Huh?
You did say it again.
Francis, Frances, Cress, Cress, Welsing, Welsing. Frances Cress Welsing, former psychologist, recently passed away. Her argument was that there is an insecurity to whiteness. Okay? If you look at the majority of the world are people who are not white. Okay? So in order for a small population of the world to control and dominate as much as they do, they have to have a defensive posture toward everybody else. Right? Because they are genetically in trouble. Considering how many of people in the world are not white. Right? So, what you have is these things, that's what white supremacy is all about. It's dominating, but it also is insecure. It's knowing that you are the minority, but surrounded by a bunch of other people. Right? And this notion of whiteness is all about mediating that insecurity and that reality. That's Wells's argument. And so that has created that, but if you look really deeply into American history, you can see it. The notion of not wanting little Sally to go to school with Leroy from the black community is knowing that. But that's how you get Drake. They cool. Steph Curry. Right? That's why black people are all different shades. Right? And so that reality is very prevalent. That is why the notion of segregation exists. That's why all these other things exist. Okay? And so what that does is, now we need nuclear weapons. Now we need nuclear bombs. Now we got to subdue nature differently. Now we got to make sure we can push these people into a position where they can't associate with us. South Africa becomes a pseudo-colony, right? In terms of the way in which you see one group, apartheid said one group of people, depending on their shade, existed in a different way. You see it in the caste system in India, all these different things. This push and pull, this grab, right? And y'all even saw it in China when I showed you all the commercials of the pyramid, right? That's the notion. And so everything that white people have done and created is out of that insecurity. You got a plantation with 300 slaves and 28 white people. So you're like, I'm gonna have to do some lynching. I'm gonna have to do some burnings. I'm gonna have to amputate some limbs. I'm gonna have to do some things. Just diabolical stuff because of the way in which that sort of fear is coinciding with your domination. Yes. Concerns, questions? No. Okay. What time?
3.
Okay. All right. So we got that. All right. The last part of this sort of is how do we actualize that in discourse? Okay. So in the competitive work, right? So your argument is that one of the things that the argument talks about is a lot of the problems that we see in the school is a result of the way in which whiteness has promoted itself. If you all looked at that diplomacy link, right? The way in which the United States was created through the breaking of treaties and the removal of people, right? And having to exalt itself because it cannot coexist with other things. I think red, white, and blue are gang colors. I think the stars are bandanas. That's what I think. I think America's a gang. That's what I think. I think they've done more damage than the Vice Lords, the GDs, the Blackstone Nation, the Crips, the Bloods, yes. The American flag is the most lethal instrument that's ever been employed in the history of the world. Rough estimates say that 10 million people we lost, between 10 and 100 million people in the transatlantic slave trade. We'll never really know the accurate number. We know that we lost at least 5,000 people in lynchings. So we've reached the nuclear war calculus already. And that's before how many you lost economically through the prison industrial complex and police brutality and those who went missing who we'll never find. So there's that. So I think whenever you see those red, white, and blue, that's gang color. They have done more set tripping than any other gang in the world. Fact. Proud to be an American, at least I know I'm free. Ooh. Let's make America great again. Since when? I think that I've done a pretty good job of showing you that it hasn't been really great ever. And if it was great, who thought it was great? Okay? Now, this teleological suspension. You're making sort of a root cause argument on a lot of things. You're saying that the way in which the things you see in the status quo, right? The breaking of treaties, the belligerent foreign policy, the problems you see in domestic policy are all rooted in this promotion of whiteness. And that by calling it out of existence, we can begin to resolve that. Because we need to push toward a fundamentally different way of understanding human beings. All right? Last concept, and then it is last concept. All right, what do you think I mean by white as the perfection of humanity? Yes.
So this actually kind of reminded me of an article I looked at. It's reminding me of an article I looked at today where like they sent this woman to different countries around the world and like they photoshopped her and almost all the countries like made her skin lighter because it was more attractive.
Right.
So like it's kind of like whiteness is what we all want to strive to be.
Whiteness is what we all strive to be. What does that mean? Give me some examples of that.
Like the kind of jobs people might choose to take, the way that they might choose to act in certain situations based on how they perceive like acceptable behavior to be.
Jobs, body performance, etc. Give me some examples.
Like you said in your lecture, the way you were dressing is that like you might want to be seen as more acceptable in certain environments.
Right. What do you mean when what you mean certain environments? Give me some examples.
Business environments, work environments.
What will be the benefit of people seeing me in a different light or seeing me as more approachable? What would it give me? What do you think?
Like a certain amount of like respect from them, or they would not see you as quite as different from themselves.
Right. Okay. Have them out. Give me some more.
In your lecture, you had talked about how like when you talk to banks or whatever, you have to like talk or act more white so that they don't perceive you as being like a risk to like allow you to like give you loans and stuff.
But I gotta perceive. Right. They have to have a perception. I have to play to what I think their perceptions of white are. Yeah. What else? Anything else? Come on. Yes.
Maybe like your name or what your name sounds like when you're applying to colleges or something like that.
Mm-hmm. What else? Yeah, you do. What when we say white is the perfection of humanity, what kind of stuff are we talking about? White what?
I'm thinking more like a gold standard, so you're always striving to be.
Gold standard, that's good language. Okay, go ahead. What else? What do you mean?
So like, take jobs for example. You're less likely to take like a job that doesn't require. So, especially in today's generation, people don't want to take jobs that don't require some sort of education, because that's perceived as something that minorities were forced to do. So, the more education you get, the better paying job that you can get, it's more perceived as a white standard.
Right. Definitely.
The concept of privilege to, be
Speak up. Okay.
the concept of privilege and people who are white having this sort of
privilege, and that is just connotated with them being able to achieve more and have more because of their skin color, because of the way they are placed in society as opposed to other races.
Fact.
Well, like, this kind of gets into, like, colorism and stuff, but, like, the way that people, the way that, like, I know a lot of my, like, one of my, black friends in particular said that when she went to, like, apply for something, she straightened her hair first,
Mhm.
like, the day before, because she says that, like, natural hair is not seen to be, like, professional.
Right. You.
Model minority community.
Okay, that's perfect. So now,
I mean, the whole idea of model minority things with white.
model minority. What does that mean?
Actually, anyway, there are minorities, like their culture and try to blend in with, I guess, what's stereotypically white culture.
What does that look like though? That's exactly what I'm trying to get at. What's the when you say stereotypically white culture? What is that?
I think just like kind of a blend, but like a very everyday example is at school you would bring a peanut butter and jelly sandwich instead of, say, for me, instead of bringing traditional dish that my family makes.
So you would use white norms and customs. So you'd sacrifice, like, give me a name of the dish. Tell me what it is.
That's so fun.
Huh?
That's so fun.
Den South End. What is that?
Eggs, just like rice and eggs. Like fried rice, basically. Okay, I was like.
So instead of bringing Den South End, you bring a peanut butter and jelly sandwich because people want to. That looks more American, more European. What else? There's a hand.
Oh, I mean, I was just I was about to say the same thing, like where people have this notion that like the model minority tries to assimilate with the white culture.
Artista, how do you think that affects religion? This notion of whiteness. See? Huh? Speak up. There's no wrong answer. Do you think whiteness is present in the way in which people practice theology?
I think like having a religion that like more white people tend to have as opposed to
Like what?
religions that look like other parts of the world, like
Having a religion that white people tend to have. Like what?
Christianity.
Oh.
Like it's just more socially acceptable than like doing some other things that might be part of other religions.
Christianity as socially acceptable. Alright. What else?
I was gonna say more on the topic of like how it relates to like religion is that in a more predominantly white religion, most of the people who they claim to be like I guess they're like God or like figure that they worship tends to be for someone who's white.
So a blonde, blue-eyed deities. The Michelangelo depiction of Christ, yes.
With like
Okay.
the idea of whiteness being that like you're like the good person that like does well in school, doesn't break laws, you're like a good Christian white person.
Law-abiding Anglo-Saxon Christian, yes. Sound good, don't it? That sounds good. You saying it didn't?
Anglo-Saxon.
Yes, yes. They call it the Protestant work. It's really a thing. It's called the Protestant work ethic. Look that up. When y'all Google that right now, the Protestant work ethic. I cannot make this stuff up. I swear. I wish I was making it. The Protestant work ethic. Did it pop up?
Yeah.
What did it say, Jacob?
It's a concept in theology, sociology, economics, and history which emphasizes that hard work, discipline, and frugality are a result of a person's subscription.
Slow down. What does it say? Protestant work ethic.
Yeah, It emphasizes hard work, discipline, and frugality as a result of a person's subscription to the values espoused by the Protestant faith, particularly Calvinism.
Wish I could make this up here. It would be easier. Alright, so the Protestant work ethic. So now we've applied frugality, what is it, hard work, and what else does it say, Jacob?
Frugality, hard work, discipline, and frugality.
You're not leaving.
Hard work. Discipline. And here's this other thing that I love. Frugality. Anybody know what that is?
Being frugal.
Louder, I can't hear you.
It's like minimizing like the money that you spend to like survive.
Right. So frugality, a lot of the reasons that people justify the oppression of black people, they say we spend too much money, we ball out on clothes, etc., etc., etc. We ought to be more frugal. Yes.
I find that like a very interesting concept because a lot of times like Jewish people get made fun of for the fact that they're like penny pinchers and stuff like that.
Right.
But that seems as like a good concept to have if you're a Christian. It's
Right.
very interesting to me.
Right. Exactly. Because if it's good and European and Christian, it's perfect. You know. Yes. Okay. So that is the reality. Is that all of these things, the notion of hard work, notion of discipline, notion of frugality, the notion of social acceptance, the notion of what is beautiful, all of these things are entangled with this notion of whiteness. Okay? And you all have to understand that when you call for a teleological suspension of that. Because what you're saying is all of this stuff over here that we use as tools of othering, gotta go. And until we do that, start that process, all the rest of it, all the things you see, the environment, the temporal degradation we're talking about, Kale's talking about the social acceptance, the way in which Farshita was talking about doing things that are religiously acceptable, who you think is a good person, how do we think of who's worth being considered a human, who do you think is capable of good behavior. Till you get rid of that whiteness, forget it. All of that stuff is on the table. And all those things proliferate in the environment. Okay? Got that? All right. So, that's going to end the discussion part. I'm going to give y'all a break, and then we're going to do some speeches, okay? All right. Thank you.